everybody, my name is Karen Fabian and I'm the founder of Bare Bones Yoga. And if you're like a lot of the yoga teachers that I talk to, you're probably wondering about the reason behind some of the cues that you hear, maybe even some of the cues that you use. And the reason behind cues typically lies in understanding the anatomy. So in this video here, I'm going to go over with you a couple of cues that you might have heard or you might be using that really relate to the anatomy. And I'll share some of the anatomy behind them to really complete your understanding of why you might use this cue. So let's take a look at a posture like Warrior One. So imagine, you're teaching Warrior One and you see a student like this. Well, you probably know from an alignment perspective that this isn't really where you want them to be. You want them to be more here. But you might be thinking, well, how am I going to get them there? And why are they actually leaning forward like that? Well, we have to first take a look at what might be pitching the pelvis forward into an anterior tilt. And sometimes what can create that is a lack of flexibility in the hip flexor on this leg here. See, this leg here, this hip is an extension, and in order to allow that to happen, muscles like the psoas need to be flexible enough to allow the hip to move into extension. When they're too tight, the pelvis is going to tip forward, and that's known as an anterior tipping. So in a standing posture or just standing in anatomical position, the pelvis is level, just like it is here in the skeleton. However, if there's some tightness in the psoas, which runs from the lumbar spine to the femur, and you're trying to move that hip into extension, that muscle's not going to allow you to do it without something else unwanted appearing. And in this case, it's going to be tipping forward of the pelvis. So a cue that you could use is to ask people to draw the belly button into the spine. You can also ask them to shorten their base a little bit. With those two things, you basically take away some of the work effort on the hip flexor here to extend by asking the person to bring their foot in. And when you ask them to draw the belly button in, you see how that action helps you level the pelvis. And why does it do that? Well, the reason it does that is because the cue to draw the belly button into the spine is cueing to a muscle that literally runs from the pubic bone up to the sternum, and it's your rectus abdominis. It's part of your four main core muscles. And because of its origin on the symphysis pubis here, the pubic bone, when you ask people to contract it, it's going to pull that part of the pelvis up, thus taking them out of the anterior tip and bringing their pelvis to a more level position. So let's take a look at another one. If you've ever had the experience of teaching, maybe a variation of, well, actually, let's do it from chair. Maybe you're teaching chair and you ask people to bring the fingers behind the back and draw the shoulder blades close to the spine. And you might say something like, notice when you draw the shoulder blades together, you get the stretch across the front of the chest. And that's kind of logical. Most people can connect to a feeling of stretch across the front of the chest when they squeeze the shoulder blades together. But the question is why? Why does that happen? Well, it happens because there's a coordinated effort between the muscles contracting back here and the muscles allowing that contraction to happen. And those muscles specifically are the rhomboid muscles back here in the middle trapezius are coming into concentric contraction to adduct the scapula. And in order for those muscles to do that, something that does the opposite needs to allow it to happen. And in this case, it's the pectoralis minor and major that allow that to happen. So here, it's a beautiful illustration of the relationship between muscles. One muscle allows while the other muscle does, and then the converse happens. This is known as the agonist-antagonistic relationship. And you can do it you can apply it to a lot of different things. You could apply it to muscles like the glute max and the psoas that we just talked about. So here I'm using my glute max, my psoas is lengthening. Here I'm using my psoas, my glute max is lengthening. So there's lots of different ways you can build that into your sequencing. So let's take a look at one more. This is one I've talked about a couple times on different videos, and it has to do with external rotation of the shoulders. So we actually see that in what we just talked about, except when we interlace the fingers behind the spine, in the example I just gave, we were talking more about the actions of the scapula to adduct. But when you are adducting your scapula in this position here, you're also externally rotating your shoulders. And the question is, who's doing that? Well, you've got two muscles of external rotation. They're part of the rotator cuff. The teres minor and infraspinatus connect your scapula to your humerus. And essentially, those are the muscles that you need to contract to allow external rotation. So imagine instead of interlacing the fingers, you had people doing cactus arms. Or imagine you were teaching them downward dog and you asked them to roll the inner eyes, the elbows forward. Imagine they were in bridge and you had them interlace the fingers behind the back. Imagine you had them coming into humble warrior and you had them interlace the fingers behind the back. Imagine you had them come into up dog and you asked them to open through the heart center. All of these cues reflect external rotation of the shoulders, and the two muscles I just referred to are concentrically contracting to allow that, teres minor and infraspinatus. So you can see there's quite a bit to the anatomy, and there's also a skill in being able to distill it and share it in understandable ways with your students. And in explaining the anatomy itself, that gives you the basis to then share it however you want. It's a very different experience than where most teachers are learning this technique of just memorizing cues. And I always say there's nothing more disempowering for a teacher to simply be repeating cues they were told to say. It's much more empowering, and it makes you feel so much more confident when you can share cues that you actually understand. You understand the anatomy behind them. So I hope you found this video helpful. What I'm going to do is attach to this video one of my most popular downloads, which is called 10 Key Steps to Understanding Anatomy. And this will give you some structure to the self-study work I'm sure you're doing to learn anatomy, and it'll give you some structure to how to approach this topic in a step-by-step way when it comes to learning it. I hope you enjoyed this. Feel free to leave any comments to this video, and I'm happy to have some back and forth conversation with you. Thanks so much for watching, and namaste.